I do remember that. It was a pretty interesting dive. It's basically you're mountain climbing upside down against the flow, pulling yourself in this crack that is flowing just an amazing amount of water.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. On this week's episode, I interview Charlie Roberson. I get a chance to talk with Charlie about his early days of diving, Florida caves, NSS-CDS, Karst Underwater Research, and of course, Fathom rebreathers. I hope you enjoy. Charlie, how are you doing today?
Hi, Nick. I'm doing well.
So you go by Charlie, because I know in a lot of places I was reading, I'll see Charles, but I'm assuming it's Charlie.
I do. I go by Charlie. Yeah, my real name is Charles, and that's actually my middle name, so makes it even more confusing and complicated on legal documents, but it's actually John Charles.
Oh, okay. Why do you decide to go by Charlie? Just easier?
Yeah, that's what I grew up going by, and never gave it that much thought. But Charles is just a little formal.
Does
and
anybody
John
call you Charles?
Oh, yeah, of course. My mother. And my wife when I'm in trouble. And
Okay. So my first question I usually like to bring to the table is, tell me about how you got into scuba diving. Tell me about that first breath underwater, that first experience. Was it love after first breath, or was it kind of how was that whole adventure?
No, the whole process was great. I mean, I was in the Navy, not a Navy diver per se, but I was in the Navy, stationed in Charleston, and a buddy of mine that I was stationed with, we decided that we wanted to get certified, and we did. We went down to the local dive shop, started the process, and it was a traditional, you go in the evenings and do your academics, then hop in the pool that they have on site. And then we came down to North Central Florida for our checkout dives. And one of the places we went for our checkout, well, we went to a couple different places. One was Troy Springs. At that time, you could only get there by boat. We hopped on Jim Hollis's River Rendezvous boat and went down to Troy and did our checkout dives. But one of the other places we went was Madison Blue, and at the time you just pulled off the road. There was nothing there. You just parked kind of in the trees, and there were no facilities. You just went diving. And while we were there, and if you don't know it, Madison Blue is one of the great cave diving sites in North Central Florida. Really one of my favorite. Probably a little less popular than some of the commercial ones, but it's a state park now, which is really nice, and they do have a lot of facilities now and places to park, but at the time, there was nothing there. And I just remember being in the water and some cave divers showed up, and I remember seeing them actually scootering past us and into the cave, and I was like, wow, that's what I want to do. That's awesome. Unfortunately, I had to wait a little while. Several months later, my ship changed home port from Charleston to Guam, which wasn't terrible for diving. It was actually great, but not for cave training, which is what I really wanted to do. But it was good because I got a lot of experience diving. I was diving, 4 to 5 days a week. When we got out there, it was there wasn't a lot of work for us, and I was getting off, at noon and going diving every day. So I got a lot of great experience diving in the Western Pacific. If you've ever been to Guam or know about it, of course, there's great coral reefs, a lot of great shore diving because it's just fringing reefs, but also a lot of World War II wreckage and shipwrecks. So there was a great cross-section of different types of diving available.
Okay, how long, first question, was this just with your open water certification?
Yeah, exactly. While I was in Guam, I progressed from an open water diver to an instructor over about a 2-year period. And I taught a little bit. I never taught a whole lot, honestly, but it just seemed like the thing to do. It was the progression that you made, right? When you were at a certain level, you became a dive master, and then you became an instructor, it seemed. Because there wasn't any other progression to be had. Certainly there was no technical training to be done. Even if I had traveled somewhere, there wasn't really technical training going on. I mean, this was the early 90s. So I was in Guam from 92 to 94. So this was sort of the birth of the tech diving revolution. I mean, I remember being in Guam reading Aquacore magazine and thinking, wow, this is really cool stuff. This is what I want to do. I can't wait to get back to Florida and do some training.
Okay, so you started your technical training after you completed your service?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like I said, there was no training to be had then. In Guam, we were doing single tank diving probably deeper than we should have been, and longer than we probably should have been. But, it was pretty benign conditions and, nothing too crazy. Yeah, after I came back from Guam, we moved to Florida. It was a good place. I was already married, so it was a good place to raise a family, good place to go to school, and of course, a good place to do what I really wanted to do, which was cave diving.
How old were you at this point?
I was like 27.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you started your technical training 27? Nice.
Yeah, 27, 28. Soon after I got here, I took cave diving instruction, cavern intro, full cave.
What organization did you choose to go with?
So I think my first cards were NACD, which is sort of, not sure if they're even still around anymore. And so it was a sort of a mix, NACD, NSS. Most of the instructors could give you either card back then. There really weren't what we call commercial cave diving training or, for-profit cave diving organizations like there are now. TDI, INTD existed, but it was strictly nitrox trimix kind of stuff. TDI didn't exist. I think it was just being formed soon after that. You went through one of the local cave agencies. Soon after I moved here, because I was an instructor, I started teaching at Jenny Springs. You may have heard of that. It's a popular cave diving site. Became their regulator repair guy and worked there for a year or two. And that was great because, of course, there's a cave on site. You can go cave diving after work. And, of course, you meet lots and lots of people.
Do you have any amazing moments, like standout moments from your cave diving or even from your time in Guam? Is there any just like standout moments that you remember? Like, oh, man, that was the top, tier of my diving so far?
Probably a lot more than we probably have time for. One of the cool things in Guam was the year that we were there. I think it was just the first year we got there. It was just bad luck, I think, but we had a lot of direct hits from typhoons. And in fact, there was a super typhoon that year, Super Typhoon Omar, which did a lot of destruction to the island. But we also had, the next year, we had a earthquake. And I tell people about this, and they can't believe the numbers because it was like something like ridiculously high, like 8.4 or something earthquake. It wasn't centered on the island. It was somewhere out in the ocean. But of course, we had the effects of it. There were significant aftershocks. And in fact, I was diving during one of the aftershocks, which was really a kind of a interesting sensation. It was like a huge Freightliner was driving over the top of us. I mean, we just had to find a rock and hang on,
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was really weird.
Did you know what was going on, at the moment?
We did. We knew what it was. A day or two before, there had been, like I said, a pretty significant earthquake, and there was a series of aftershocks. And I think that was the largest aftershock we were actually underwater for, and it was much more pronounced and loud underwater, I can tell you that.
So back to the Florida cave diving. Obviously, there was a draw there from the beginning. how did you get involved with Karst Underwater Research?
That actually came quite a bit later. I was doing a lot of diving. Like I said, I met a lot of people, I had some good mentors, and I got involved in the industry pretty quickly. From Jenny Springs, I actually was recruited to help open Extreme Exposure in 1999, which is a shop there in High Springs. And from there, I was the manager at Extreme Exposure, and then we sort of split off Halcyon Manufacturing. I'm sure you've heard of Halcyon. So it was sort of born out of Extreme Exposure. We split that off in 2001, early in 2001, before 9/11, and I was the sales manager at Halcyon until 2004. So I was involved in the industry pretty early on, and as a sales manager at Halcyon, I really, one of my biggest responsibilities was growing initially the dealer network and then the, international network of dealers and distributors. So it was a great experience. Learned a lot about business as well as the diving industry. After Halcyon, I went back to law. I finished my degree, went to law school, ended up practicing law for about 10 years. So I took a little bit of time off during law school. But after law school, I, really had the time and a little more money and was really wanted to get back into it. So started diving again pretty regularly. And I had known Brett and some of the KUR people. So, I called up Brett. We were talking about different things, and I think they had dove Weeki Wachee, I believe, 1 or 2 seasons previously. And this was about 2010, 2011, somewhere in there. They were able to get back into... Yeah, they were sort of looking forward to the 2012 season, hoping to get back in Weeki Wachee. And in fact, we were able to, and so I went and was able to get in. Not everybody was on their first try, so I do remember that. It was a pretty interesting dive. It's basically you're mountain climbing upside down against the flow, pulling yourself in this crack that is flowing just an amazing amount of water, and it's just upper body strength. Luckily, I was in decent shape at the time and was able to get in. I remember Brett telling me nobody's ever gotten in their first time with a dry suit, so you shouldn't wear a dry suit. And I was like, well, I don't really have a wetsuit that fits me, so I'm going to give it a shot. And luckily, I was able to get in with a set of 104s and a dry suit. But it was very difficult. And since we've really stopped using that entrance, you can only get in at Weeki Wachee there in drought seasons, which is why initially they were sporadically getting in only in certain years, and it was years that there was a significant drought, which doesn't speak well for the aquifer. Since then, of course, we've connected it to Twin D's, which is also on the property. It's sort of a backdoor, much smaller entrance, but it's much more controlled and not nearly as difficult or dangerous.
I'm not a cave diver. It's definitely a direction that I'm looking to get into, not in a rush or anything like that, but one of the things that I do hear, you hear about there's obviously Florida, there's Mexico, but the flow that you find in Florida, I've heard can be kind of a turnoff for a lot of people. That obviously wasn't the case for you, just rock climbing through areas. That was, is that something that you kind of look forward to? It seems like a lot of the Florida divers, cave divers, they're really into that sort of thing. But it obviously didn't deter you from that type of diving.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to dive in Florida, or if you're going to cave dive in Florida, you're going to learn how to dive in the flow, because so many of the caves do have high flow here. Not all of them. I mean, it's one nice thing about Florida is there is a lot of variety. You have high flow, low flow, shallow caves, deep caves. Mexico, on the other hand, is most of the caves are more similar with a lower flow but more decorated, of course, because of that.
So, is there what's a favorite dive site that you have cave in Florida? Is there like a typical, what's like a fun day? You got a day off, you're going to go and just do a fun dive. What would that be?
Yeah, just a fun dive, not a project dive, would be something like Madison Blue. Scootering. Of course, we have a permit there, which is unfortunately the only way you can scooter. I think it's too bad. I wish the state would reconsider that, but they don't allow scooters unless you have a permit. Scootering back into the courtyard is an amazing dive.
Cool. So you'd mentioned projects, and you were kind of talking a little bit about that before. Is there any highlight projects that you want to mention, or?
Sure. I mean, I think the one that everybody knows us for is Weeki Wachee, and people have seen some of the amazing photos and video that have come out of there. And if you haven't, you should quickly look it up. One of my dive buddies, Andy Pitkin, has a Vimeo site with just some amazing video, and Kirill and others have done some great photography in there documenting the system. My interest is really exploration. So for me, the documentation is coming back with survey and trying to extend the line and add new line. So that's certainly one of them. We've really sort of patiently been trying to dive a system called Line Eater, which is up on the Swanee, and it runs parallel to the Falmouth Cathedral system. You may or may not know that myself and John Burnett have the end of the line in the Falmouth Cathedral system, which is the current world record. Line Eater is very close to that now. We've been diving it, although not as much as we'd like in the last few years because the conditions just haven't been great. It seems like every time we get ready to do some long-range diving in there, we'll get some rains and it'll flood and it'll go under, which is unfortunate. But, you just have to be patient. That's one thing I've learned is be ready. Have the equipment, have the training, have the experience, because it will clear and you have to be ready to go when that happens.
Having a background from law, is there a lot of legal holdups in doing these type of projects, or do you have to get the right permits and things like that, or is it kind of just when you can get in there because the conditions are right?
It's a little of both. I mean, we've had better luck with permitting than conditions, I'll say. We have access to a lot of places that you just can't seem to catch a break on as far as the conditions go. I think that's probably a trend. Unfortunately, we see less diving days each year, probably because of the water usage here in Florida and the different pressures on the aquifer. But, my legal background has helped with some of the permitting. We have good relationships with the state, multiple state agencies. We have permits with the DEP, which run the state parks, and we have good relationships with some of the water management districts and have permits with them. But we also have some private landowner permits. For example, Line Eater is a private site.
It's just owned, and you have to approach the owner.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I actually approached the guy. He's a fellow attorney. I didn't know him. In fact, I didn't even know he was an attorney when I approached him. But he's a plaintiff's attorney that lives in Jacksonville. And, I reached out to him, and he was like, wow, that sounds really cool. And, he looked at our website and saw that, well, the state trusts you, so maybe I can too. and to be honest, that really does help. There's nobody wants to be the only person trusting somebody, so they feel like, well, others have trusted this group, so I'm a little safer trusting them as well.
No, that's awesome. And hopefully you guys will be able to get in there soon. So looking at back to your resume, how did you get involved with the NSS-CDS? I noticed you're the chairman of the Accident Analysis Committee, and then I believe I thought you were on the board.
Yeah, I was, and actually this last weekend was the end of my 2-year term. And I didn't run again. The reason I ran was myself and one of my buddies, we really felt that the cave diving section was having some trouble internally. Either it was probably going to go away or somebody needed to step up and do something about it. And so we did. We sort of stepped in, and I feel like we righted the ship, put it in a much better place than it was. So we sort of fulfilled our mission, and we stepped away because both of us, myself and Andy Pitkin, are both directors of KUR, and we both have pretty busy lives. The last thing we needed was another commitment, but we felt it was important to do, and so that's what we did. And part of that was kind of my own personal goal was to reestablish accident analysis within the CDS. It's been lacking for 20 plus years. There's been some accident analysis, but very little, particularly over the last 10 years, which is really unfortunate. If you know anything about cave diving, you know that all our training is based on accident analysis. There's usually a fatality, or at least one, sometimes multiple, that led to the rules and training as we know it. And you don't have to look very far to realize that cave diving in general, but particularly cave diving, has changed tremendously in the last 20 years. Technology has progressed. Scooters are commonplace now. Lights that will burn longer than you really need them to. And then, of course, rebreathers. So the whole face of technical and particularly cave diving has changed. But the accident analysis has not kept up with that change. So we don't really know. I mean, we have ideas and hunches about what's killing people, but without some type of formalized accident analysis, you really are only guessing. So I really thought it was important to bring accident analysis back to the commonplace where it's expected and happens every time there's an incident.
What was the reason that it kind of fell off?
There's probably a number of reasons. Some of it was politics. It's as simple as that. Okay.
That's awesome that you guys are getting that going back, because I like I said, my limited knowledge, I know the Sheck Exley book was based on a lot of his accident experiences, and that was kind of the I want to say maybe the Bible at the beginning of the cave diving.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of, like I said, the rules of cave diving and our training is sort of based around that. But things have changed a lot. For example, one of those rules is lights. Nobody's really dying from lack of having an adequate lighting anymore, which is good. It means that rule was successful, but it also means that we need to look a little deeper into other issues. Of course, like I said, rebreathers being one of the biggest now. Rebreathers were not being used.
Let's talk about rebreathers. Let's talk about Fathom.
Sure.
So how did that all come about?
Yeah, it was really a process for me. I was not an early adopter. I looked at rebreathers as wasn't really sure that this is something I wanted to adopt at all. I was very skeptical. I saw some of the advantages. Being involved with Halcyon in the early days, we had the RB80, which was a semi-closed unit, but I was much more skeptical of CCRs. It was really the diving with KUR and doing some of the deeper dives, some of the deeper exploration that made me realize at some point you sort of transition to you need that, not only need it logistically, but it becomes safer. And I never really thought I would say that. I always looked at CCRs as adding risk because it is a more complicated system, right?
Yeah.
And complexity adds risk. So it doesn't get much simpler than a simple first stage, second stage regulator. But it took doing those dives into the deeper areas, longer profiles, to make me really recognize that not only would this be beneficial, but it would actually be safer. And at some point, you kind of cross a threshold where you trade off that complexity. It doesn't get less complex. That risk is still there, but the risk of deeper diving and the deeper exposures on open circuit where you have such a limited amount of gas, that risk starts outweighing the added risk from the complexity of the unit.
Okay, so what was the final decision of I'm going to go start my own company? How did that all come about?
I didn't start off thinking that I was going to start a company. I just started looking for rebreathers and started kind of doing my homework and trying to understand them. That was a bit of a process, just trying to educate myself as much as I could.
To be honest, that's the boat that I'm in right now, because I'm starting to look at rebreathers. So it's not knowing much about them. It's definitely kind of a process to learn about them. And, there's obviously many different units out there and many different opinions, I should say, also. So it's kind of hard to navigate where to go or what to do. So I can understand the process.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just read everything I could and just tried to really think about it conceptually, to try to understand them. And part of that process was trying to figure out what rebreather I was going to buy for myself. I narrowed it down to several units, but none were really perfect. There was nothing out there that was like, this is exactly what I need. So I started playing around with the idea of building my own. I actually did get a unit, and I started diving a Meg, which is a great unit, and it did what I needed it to do. It was an older Meg. It worked great, but it was an ECCR, and that doing some of the longer dives in Falmouth Cathedral system, where our dives were approaching, ultimately they were like 16 hours. They were approaching 10, 12 hours at the time. I really started feeling the complacency creeping in, and that troubled me, and I decided that I really wanted an MCCR. So there was nothing on the market that really fit that bill for me, so I just started working to build my own. Ultimately, that's what we did. I was still practicing law at the time and formed a company. I think our first units were, I started diving a unit at the beginning of 2016, ended up selling the first units the end of 2016, I think in November, December. So I test dove it for about a year, and in fact, myself and John did our big dive at Falmouth Cathedral on the Fathom.
Oh,
it was
cool.
One of the first two units, in fact. So it was sort of a good proving ground, and I talk a little bit about this on the website, but there were certain things I wanted, and I wanted a high performance rebreather. I wanted long duration, I wanted good efficiency, and great work of breathing. So I just really didn't want to compromise any of those aspects. So that's what led me to a radial scrubber, a large radial scrubber for maximum efficiency and duration. Back-mounted counterlungs, they breathe great. That was important, but also wanted to be really a robust unit. So I wanted to be able to take it anywhere in the world and not miss dives because of it. And I saw that a lot, particularly back, I think units have progressed a bit, but 10, 15 years ago, living here in cave country, I would see people all the time that were here on vacation with a $10,000 rebreather, and they were renting a set of doubles because they couldn't dive their rebreather. So, and it was always something, electronics or battery or this or that. So I just wanted a really simple unit that I was going to be able to dive no matter where I went and what happened.
Okay. So how did I know a little bit of the story, but how did the Gemini come on the scene?
So, the Gemini, I think it's no mystery where that design comes from. Mike Young Sidewinder, the KISS Sidewinder, was very successful, and we saw that, and People asked me for years to build one. They love that design, that basic design of the split scrubber, but there were certain things they wanted different, let's say. So people begged me for years, and ultimately I didn't do it or didn't pursue it until Mike sold the company. And I don't know whether he's feels this way or not, but I felt that once he sold the company, all bets were off. He as the designer no longer was producing the units, so not that there was a patent or anything, but I just sort of didn't feel comfortable doing it until that happened. And in fact, he did sold the company, so I felt free to go ahead and pursue that, which is exactly what people were asking me to do. And it's been hugely successful. People have bought them left and right, and we've made some improvements. We've tried to make it as robust as possible, just like our back-mounted unit. And there's a couple things philosophically we as a company believe in, and one of those things is redundant monitoring. So the unit comes standard with a HUD. I will not sell a rebreather without redundant monitoring. I don't think anybody should, frankly. I've been on dives where batteries have gone dead and my dive buddy lost all monitoring at quite a long distance into the cave. That's not a good feeling. It wasn't a good feeling for me, and I'm sure it wasn't for my buddy at the time. Changed his opinion on redundant monitoring as well. It's one thing we insist on. We have our own HUD, so we build the electronics, and it had some nice features, including a visual alarm feature, which I feel pretty strongly about. So it has a built-in visual alarm above a 1.6 or below a 0.4. It goes full brightness and flashes red, green, red, green, red, green. It's pretty unmistakable, in fact. If you spike your oxygen up and get it above a 1.6, it's quite alarming. And Shearwater has done the same now. They have an alarm on the Petrel 3. They have a new haptic alarm. So we introduced the visual alarm on the HUD about the same time that the Petrel 3 came out. So now you have an alarm feature on both of your monitoring devices, which to me is a huge improvement.
Okay. Is there anything exciting in the future for Fathom? Any latest developments or anything like that?
We're always working on new things. There's probably nothing just around the corner. I mean, we just released the Gemini in November at DEMA, and we're just working as hard as we can to produce units because, like I said, it's been very successful and really sort of widening our visibility on the international stage. We're selling a lot of them overseas, and we're starting to expand into areas that we didn't really have a lot of customers in the past, which is great.
Okay. What kind of areas are those?
You name it. I mean, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, in your backyard there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely awesome.
There's one thing I probably should have mentioned about the Fathom, that when I designed it, I said I wanted an MCCR. I did a lot of homework about MCCRs, and I decided that the way to do it was with a needle valve rather than a fixed orifice. In my reading and learning process, I sort of came across this idea. We certainly weren't the first to think about it, to use a needle valve. In fact, the Pelagian uses a needle valve. They use it a little differently than we do. They use it with a standard unblocked first stage. We have a little bit different approach. We use it with a blocked first stage, just like a normal fixed orifice. But we do put a stiffer spring in that first stage, so we increase the depth limit considerably.
Just to bring it back a little bit, I know that in my reading, I'm finding, there's some people that push the ECCR as opposed to the MCCR. What, do you want to weigh in on? Obviously, MCCR is kind of where the direction that you went into, but is there anything you want to add to that? I don't want to say argument, but because that's one thing that I'm reading. It's like, oh, okay. Because I don't know what direction to go into, just because I don't know what I don't know. I'm still learning. But what are the advantages that you would say over an MCCR over an ECCR?
Sure. This is a huge kind of philosophical choice, I think, and it sort of depends on where you fall in this debate. Like I said, in practice, I was using a ECCR for some long-range cave diving, and I felt that complacency creeping in. And that troubled me. It's one thing for your instructor to say, know your PO2, and actually doing it. I believe, and our philosophy is that we believe that the equipment should assist the diver. It's easy to sit back and look at a fatality or an accident and say, well, he didn't know his PO2. He did all the wrong things, Number one rule of CCR diving, know your PO2, and he messed up. Okay, but let's look at it a little deeper. What made him mess up? What were the human factors surrounding that? I believe that certain machines will assist the diver. So what we like to say is that an MCCR promotes good habit formation. It's not a panacea. It's not going to be a magic bullet, but it helps you to build those habits so that when you are task loaded, those good habits are ingrained and take over. On the other end of the spectrum, an ECCR doesn't promote those habits. In fact, it rewards bad habits. You could probably, and part of it is that they work so well. You could probably go dive an ECCR, just pick one, any one on the market, and do 100 dives, and you'd be fine. Probably. But that 101st time where you forgot to change the battery or you forgot to turn your oxygen on, and it's usually the human element that gets you. It's very rare. These machines very rarely fail. We are much more apt to fail and forget as humans. So, you forget to change the battery or you forget to turn the oxygen on that 101st time because you did not have those good habits of checking your PO2. Then you get into trouble. And so this is the kind of philosophical debate.
Okay. So me looking at rebreathers, I'm very early on, and I completely understand that kind of what you're saying. These are tools to get jobs done. So I'm looking at that in an aspect of, or that's the aspect I'm looking at when I'm looking into a rebreather. Me, I think it would be amazing to get into exploration. I think it would be amazing to get into that. I'm in no rush to get there, but one of the biggest things for me and why I'm looking at units like the Gemini or the Sidewinder is their travel capabilities. I think max they're the Gemini is like 24 pounds or something.
Pounds. It's very lightweight.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at more like my biggest thing is the travel friendly aspect of it, but then there's a lot of push saying a side mount rebreather should not be a person's first rebreather.
Yeah, it's a really important question, actually. And I generally agree that it should not be a first rebreather. Side mount rebreathers, all of them, are compromises in some way or another. And the reason that they're compromises is because they just don't have as much space to put things. So when you start designing rebreathers, you start realizing that space on the body starts getting eaten up pretty quickly, right? And if you say, okay, we're not going to put anything on your back because it's going to be a side mount rebreather that is used in side mount situations, then you've eliminated a considerable area for putting things like the scrubber or bottles or all the other things that are required on top of your already normal open circuit diving equipment. Rebreathers, side-mounted rebreathers are compromises in one way or another, and they all compromise in different ways. Maybe water tolerance, it may be work of breathing, or it may be a combination of those two things. But those are the kind of the big ones. work of breathing and water tolerance. And for example, the Sidewinder, the Gemini, the split scrubber design, they breathe great and they have great buoyancy and they're really easy to dive. They have crappy water tolerance. I mean, it's just the nature of the design. So as easy as they are, and you see a lot of newer divers jumping onto them, it sort of belies the real risk, because it seems real easy. Hey, this is great. I'm doing great. Super easy to dive. But you do have less water tolerance than a typical back-mounted unit. For example, the back-mounted Fathom, we have T-pieces that prevent the water from going back to the scrubber. The water goes into the counterlungs initially. Those counterlungs will hold a lot of water before it starts going back into the scrubber. And you can dump that water. Now, one thing we have done with the Gemini is we've put a dump into the counterlung, so it does allow you to dewater it, but that water has already come through scrubber number 1. So there's a possibility that you've got some caustic water in there, and if you don't get it all out, if you go head down, that could easily come back into the inhale side of the loop. Whereas with most back-mounted units, you just don't have that level of risk for water getting in the unit.
Okay. My next question is, you kind of were talking about beginners jumping onto units like the side mount units. What are your thoughts on, do you think that there's a movement of people moving really too quickly into technical or overhead environments? Do you think that's newer as opposed to 20 years ago? It wasn't so fast paced, people moving into these type of diving environments, or what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's people are moving too quickly into this type of diving?
Well, there's no question that the technology allows you to get a lot further back in the cave or a lot deeper in the ocean than you could 20 years ago. DPVs, CCRs, the lighting technology, all the things that make it easier for us to explore further, also makes it a lot easier for a brand new cave diver, or let's say even maybe they're not brand new, but relatively inexperienced cave diver, tech diver, to get in over their head. Absolutely. Look, there's always been people that have pushed it from the early days of cave and technical diving. You've seen people going too far too fast. The technology certainly makes that easier to do now.
My last question, what advice would you give to, say it's yourself 20 years ago, fresh out of open water? What advice would you have for that person?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, I got really lucky. I got kind of matched up with some really good mentors, which steered me in the right direction. But, that being said, I also did my homework. I sort of knew who I wanted to take training from. And it wasn't just because they were the cheapest or easiest to find. It was because they were doing the kind of dives that I aspired to do. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is look for instructors and mentors that are doing the dives safely.
Okay. And then any last piece of advice, any last words before we sign off?
I mean, it's a great sport. There's lots to do. Enjoy the process, enjoy the path, and don't move too fast, build your skills, sort of like you're building a pyramid, right? And your foundational skills are still critical and important at the highest levels of diving. In fact, they're the most important.
Offgassing, a scuba podcast.